man there trying to stop Drogba getting himself into further trouble.
Oh, it's not a bad ball for Pele on the right side. It's Carlos Alberto. And what a great goal that was! Carlos Alberto.
Maradona just walked away from Huddle then. Maradona smoked and Maradona! They're appealing for offside. The ball came back off the foot of Steve Hodge. And Maradona gives Argentina the lead. The England players protesting to the referee.
Halve finale komen. Ik heb opeens zo'n gevoel dat we in de halve finale gaan komen. Met de balbezit voor Frank de Boer. Frank de Boer speelt de bal. Heel goed naar Dennis Bergkamp. Dennis Bergkamp. Dennis Bergkamp neemt de bal aan. Dennis Bergkamp. Dennis Bergkamp. Dennis Bergkamp. Dennis Bergkamp. Dennis Bergkamp. Oh! Frank de Boer speelt de bal naar Dennis Bergkamp. Die neemt de bal feilloos aan. En die schiet de bal erin.
So I'm delighted to be joined by Ibrahim Mustapha on the podcast today to talk about the book No Longer Naive, which I have with me here handily. Ibrahim, just for our listeners, would you mind briefly introducing yourself a little bit and also maybe a bit about what inspired you to write the book in the first place?
Hey Alex, and hey everyone listening. I'm as you said, I'm Ibrahim Mustapha. I'm a journalist and author. I've been a journalist for quite some time now. Can't even work out, nearly 15 years now, maybe a little bit longer. But yeah, just sort of back and forth, broadcast, written journalism, radio, TV, online, the lot. And I think basically what happened was pre-lockdown, the first big lockdown once the world shut down back at the start of 2020, I actually lost the job that I was doing at the time, and so I was sort of stuck at home twiddling my thumbs a bit. I mean, I was freelancing from home, but just trying to get work where I could. And I thought, I had time to myself. I thought that this idea that I had sort of festering in my head that had been sitting there for a number of years, I thought finally get it to put pen to paper and finally get this book about African football that I'd been thinking about down. And and that's what I did. I spent quite a few months on that, just trapped in the comfort of my living room. And then, and it's there for people to read should they choose.
Yeah, what I really found interesting reading it was kind of the progression of FIFA kind of having to take account of Africa, or let African teams into the World Cup, because you read kind of the history of the World Cup and it was very much a European, South American thing only. And I think would you say the kind of 1966 kind of boycott of the African teams was in some ways kind of the turning point of this, and then they kind of had to actually change with the way they were managing things?
Well, hugely. I mean, because before that, I mean, without giving too much away of the book, I mean, you see that fundamentally, like you say, it's a Eurocentric, South American focus, the World Cup, and other parts of the world were all sort of funneled into these weird qualification processes where you'd have sort of countless teams from Africa battling out for one spot to face off against like an Asian team who would still have to face against one of the leftover European sides for a place in the tournament. So, and that was pretty much all the way up to, like you say, 1966, where more African countries have started to become independent off the back of sort of post-colonialism, and these countries have started getting together their own football teams without the say-so of sort of prior colonial rulers. I'm sure we'll get onto that later when we get to the main subject of what we're talking about today. But and a lot of these sides are finally finding their independence and ultimately turning around in the football world now and saying, look, give us at least one place at a World Cup. And FIFA basically said no. I mean, the head of FIFA at the time was an Englishman, Sir Stanley Rouse, and he was very much not interested in giving Africa that guaranteed spot. And the promise came from the next guy who would eventually take over from him, the Brazilian João Havelange, who basically wooed Africa with all these promises of more inclusivity, which he delivered on. It's there's no two ways about it, but obviously he's done it for votes to get the African bloc of votes, and it worked in his favor, and it worked out for Africa in the end. So after 1966, as you say, there was a boycott. African teams just refused to partake in the qualifying process, and as FIFA was growing at that time, that was a terrible look for them. Really, you can't claim to be a World Cup if an entire continent of countries are just turning around and saying, well, we're not going to be a part of your extravaganza that you claim.
Yeah,
is
we
inclusive.
actually had that as a trivia question when we were looking at the 1966 World Cup, and it was how many teams actually played matches from both Asia and Africa to qualify for the World Cup, and it was 2. It was a playoff between North Korea and Australia.
Yeah, there you go.
And that's your entire representation of Europe and Asia.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? And so beyond that, then they started to include African teams, and so the first 1970 was Morocco, the first African team to play in the World Cup. 74 you had Zaire, 78 you had Tunisia, 82 you had 2 teams because the tournament was growing. And again, these promises that Havelange made when he became FIFA president was that, we're going to keep increasing the number of teams that are allowed. In 82 you had Algeria and Cameroon. In 86 you had Algeria again and Morocco again. 1990 you had Cameroon and Egypt, and then after that it becomes 3 teams, then it becomes 5 teams, and then we sort of get to the present day. I won't name every team that's ever played there, but that's it has progressed ever since that infamous boycott of 1966, basically.
Yeah, I think we subjected ourselves to the FIFA propaganda film United Passions, which I don't know whether you've seen, but
I have not.
It was probably that's for the best. But one of the things that it does kind of show is that actually, one of the ways that sort of Havelange and Sepp Blatter got power within FIFA, is, like you said, was that they recognized that the old guard were, just completely ignoring and mistreating African countries and also other regions of the world. And this was a great way of them to gain votes. And do you think, other than sort of increased participation in the World Cup, do you think FIFA has actually, taken African countries into the footballing family, or is it still that kind of old relationship?
It's difficult to say. Sort of, it's a two-way thing, really. It's kind of like, if they are adopting the African nations and saying, look, we want more of you in the tournament, they've had sort of no choice but to sort of try and help filter down a bit more in terms of, like I say, the inclusivity in terms of whether it be money or just influence to be able to get in there and maybe have a sort of direct them in the right way. But, without wanting to get myself sued, there's obviously instances where money might not end up where it's supposed to go to, and people making agreements with one another that may not be in the best interest of the actual football teams, but simply just a front of in terms of representation for representation's sake, rather than the actual intention to improve the football, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. And getting on to the main topic that we wanted to talk about today, which was Senegal in 2002. Is this Senegal and maybe Ghana in 2010? Are they kind of the sort of seminal sort of African teams of the World Cup, sort of both culturally and impact wise?
I would say Cameroon in 1990. They really set the bar there. And then you had Nigeria in 94 and 98. Perhaps they didn't get as far in the tournament, but there was definitely a cultural impact there where their performances had people stand up and had a bit more notice of African teams and players, and a lot of the players end up migrating to Europe and playing for European teams throughout the 90s, just based off initially Cameroon, but then just the sort of performance of Nigeria in 94 and again perhaps in 98 as well. Perhaps less so in 98. They probably were players were probably more well known by then. In 2002 with the Senegal, that was almost like something completely new, because there are parallels to be drawn with the Cameroon performance in 1990, in that perhaps they were more unknown to sort of the wider global footballing populace, basically. But they were. It was an interesting that, because the history of Senegal as a country is. It was obviously colonized by France. It was part of French West Africa initially until they gained their independence, and was actually one of the countries that post-colonialism actually did relatively okay, if you want to I mean, without getting too much into geopolitical stuff, it wasn't. It's like a lot of countries end up breaking down in terms of civil war and things like that. Senegal was one of the ones that, I mean, I think they were literally referred to, perhaps by a European, as the beacon of African sort of stability, basically.
When did Senegal get independence? Sorry.
It would have been.
Sorry, I didn't mean to put it like.
No, sorry. I think it's either 1958 or 1960.
Okay, so it's that
that era, that time. And so they've but on the footballing stage, despite how the country had seemed to be perceived as stable, they hadn't really made any sort of impact on the global stage anyway, and barely even in Africa. I mean, they'd never gone beyond the quarterfinals of the AFCON in all their appearances until 2002, when they got to the final and lost on penalties to Cameroon, who were at that time considered the best team in Africa. And funny enough, in 2002, when Cameroon went to the World Cup, people expected them to do really well. People thought that, you know, this is the time African football is going to make it to the latter stages, and it's going to be Cameroon. They'd won the Olympic gold in 2000, and like I say, they just beat Senegal in the AFCON in the months leading up to the World Cup in Korea and Japan. So everyone was really sort of putting their hopes on Cameroon there. And even their group, they had Germany, who weren't the best Germany, although they got to the final. They had Ireland and Saudi Arabia. So people, I mean, no, but Ireland surprised people.
Roy Keane less Ireland.
I mean, Ireland surprised people in that tournament, probably as much so as Senegal did, to be honest, because a lot of people didn't, particularly with the Roy Keane thing, people didn't really expect Ireland to do a great deal, but you know, it was great for them, wasn't it? Sorry, back to Senegal, sort of deviate from them. So they've got to the AFCON final that year, but people still didn't really know a great deal about them, although a lot of their squad were playing in France. You know, there's a connection there because
it was like I think almost all but two were basically playing in
21
France.
of the 23 were playing in France leading up to the tournament. So, you know, while there might have been a shock factor around the rest of the world, there should have been no excuses for France, truth be told, because they were well aware of what these players could do. They may not have been playing for the top sides, but they were well aware that these players are playing within your country. So, you know, be aware of them. Although, ironically, all the France players were probably playing abroad. So, there you go.
Yeah. But what's because I was reading the kind of Senegalese-French relationship is maybe not quite as acrimonious as, you know, other former colonial states.
Yeah, I think, I think there's still quite a lot of French influence in terms of sort of governance. And there's a pathway for people to sort of migrate between the two countries, but from Senegal to France. And one of the protagonists of that opening game, that infamous opening game between France and Senegal, Patrick Vieira, was born in Senegal, Dakar, and he was raised there till he was 6 years old before his family moved to France. And he moved to France and then became, you know, French footballing legend, one of the best players in the world at the time. And so there again, these connections between these two countries set up for there was so much narrative going into that opening game where they played against each other. And of course, as we all know now, Senegal pulled off this shock win where they beat France, who were of course the world and European champions at the time. So it was all it's all very interesting. It's a great story, and one that I think that sort of will resonate for many, many, many years to come.
Yeah, and was it kind of, I mean, I was reading also, you know, the French team, there was some comments about them maybe not taking the Senegalese team so seriously. Do you think all this was which kind of motivated the Senegal? Like there was, you know, the first ever World Cup game and then it was against France. It was kind of the perfect kind of storm for them in some ways.
Absolutely, unquestionably. It definitely would have been, I mean, like I say, France were world and European champions. In the sense that, yes, they would have probably taken Senegal lightly, but I don't want to say justifiably, but in their minds, I mean, it's a natural complacency that I imagine will kick in if you consider yourself that dominant and that good, and you face up against a team making their World Cup debut that, you know, they would have thought that this game, even playing at sort of 75%, they probably thought they would have won. You know, they expected to win. They walked into the game thinking that the game was theirs. And obviously, on the flip side of that, Senegal, of course, will be motivated. I mean, like I said, you had so many players playing in France who probably would have been hearing in the months building up to the game that, okay, France are, how people predict stuff. They would have probably just not even considered Senegal as a threat, basically. And these players, of course, that's going to be building inside them as they head into that game. And Senegal also had a French manager as well, who obviously had his motivations to beat France as well. So, he would have been drumming into their heads how important it was to win this match, and they went out and did it.
Yeah, what is the story with Bruno Metsu, the coach? Because he was reading that he sort of had this very, I want to say, laissez-faire approach to the team, and that he kind of let some of the individuals like El Hadji Diouf kind of get away with certain things which wouldn't normally fly. Where did he kind of come from, and where did he fit into the story?
His sort of career trajectory is he was quite nomadic before that. It wasn't a huge amount of success. I mean, he tried other African countries and things didn't really stick before that. Then he took over Senegal in 2002, and then it just seemed like everything, right man, right place, right time. He managed to make them better than they ever were before. And again, through that approach, perhaps, like, it's spotting the talent and nurturing that talent and saying, like, look, you're as good as you are, go out there and show it, which is effectively a contrast to what happens to a lot of African nations when they hire European managers, who a lot of them sort of come in with this or had in the past. Well, this still happens now, but they come in with this approach, of this European approach, a bit more less willing to allow players to express themselves and want to be more rigid and more tactical and trying to get them, and just that almost a bit.
Is that because of certain sort of stereotypes about African players that we need to, well, they're all skillful, but we need to teach them how to how to build from the back, or like have a flat back four and that kind of thing, and then need to provide these structures? Is that where that kind of approach comes from?
I mean, that's exactly where it comes from. Yeah. It's this idea that they don't know how to structure themselves. I mean, some of these stereotypes are rooted in fact, unfortunately, but equally, it is this idea that, I mean, the title of the book, I said no longer naive. It's because of that word naive was always attributed to African teams. Once it all went wrong, it's like, oh, this team is completely naive in their approach to a game. They don't know how to close out a game. I mean, going back to the previous two examples of Nigeria and Cameroon 2-1 up against England in 1990 in the quarterfinal, and then concede 2 penalties and end up going out, albeit in heroic circumstances. Nigeria 1-0 up against Italy in the second round in 94, 1 minute left to play, concede a goal, and then go on to lose. And I think that's where that sort of idea comes from, the naivety of these teams that can't see it out all the way to the end. And but that isn't necessarily the be all and end all to sort of rein that in. And that is what Metsu was good at with Senegal. He sort of allowed them to express themselves in that game against France. Like, El Hadji Diouf is running this far more experienced French. He was incredible from the word go as well. It's not like he even grew into the game. From the first couple of minutes, if you rewatch the game, he is running at this French defense. He gets caught out offside quite a few times, but it's still amusing to see the likes of Marcel Desailly and Frank Leboeuf just bamboozled. They have no idea what to do with him. Like, he kept switching flanks. He's running through the middle half the time, and they didn't know how to contain him. And it was brilliant. And even in the midfield, I mentioned Patrick Vieira, and that was the big story there, was the fact that he was being shackled in that midfield by these really aggressive midfielders of like Salif Diao and Papa Bouba Diop in slightly more advanced, but they're around him, and they don't let him see the ball, or if they do, they're closing him off and stopping him making the passes that he can and always did do. So it was very interesting. They went in there bold. They went in very bold against France, and France didn't expect that at all. It was rather than sitting back as many teams might tend to do against a team of supposed superiority, they went for it and got their just rewards in the end.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is the first World Cup I kind of remember watching, and you kind of have these memories of these games, and then you rewatch them now, and you kind of see how your kind of memory or story doesn't match up to reality. So in my head, it had always been this kind of like somewhat kind of like smash and grab job, and then they scored the goal, and I know Henry hit the crossbar and that kind of thing as well. But when I watched the game back, I was like, well, I mean, the better team completely, and France just looked so slow and kind of pedestrian.
Yeah, I mean, totally. It's I mean, I felt the same when I was, as part of the research. When I sort of rewatched it, I was surprised by how quickly Senegal came out of the blocks in that game. I mean, as the game wears on, France sort of start to take control, but they just can't find a way through. But they didn't know what, they didn't expect this from Senegal. It is the first half performance anyway, and it was a deserved winning. It wasn't a smash and grab. It wasn't a backs to the wall kind of thing. It was, they went for it, they got it out there. And that's the thing. They went into the next couple of games. I mean, they went in against Denmark, and it was as a draw, 1-1 draw, but it was just sort of like another back and forth. Really, they conceded early on, equalized, fantastic equalizer for Salif Diao, and then he got sent off just to show how how exciting things were for them at the time. And then the final group game, which they it turned out they needed a point to go through, but they went racing to a 3-0 lead against Uruguay. So the 3-0 first half lead, and sort of going back to the point what I was saying about the naivety, it's like they almost didn't know what to do.
I was going to ask you about this, because I
almost had no idea what to do, and then very nearly threw it away. That is a fantastic game. One of the games of the tournament that was. If you get a chance to rewatch that, even in just extended highlights, it goes back. It's so good.
I watched it. I watched the game the other day, and I like, if you're stuck for something to do over Christmas, just watch this game. It's just it's so much fun. Like you said, they go up 3-0 at halftime and completely dominant. Like, I feel like Uruguay barely had a kick of the ball, and then the second half, and then my endearing memory also of watching that game back is I think it's 3-3, and the sort of ball it's in the last minute, it kind of floats into the box, and Silva, the Senegalese goalkeeper, sort of charges out to the edge of the 18-yard box, and there's a shot, and then I can't remember who heads, I think it's Diatta maybe, heads it off the line in like the 92nd minute. It's crazy.
Yeah, he heads it off the line, and that's not even the move over. It sort of loops up in the air. He heads it straight up in the air, and it's I think it's Morales, the Uruguayan forward, who I think he'd scored already.
Oh yes, Morales. Yes,
and he leaps up for the header, and everyone just freezes because it's like, this is it. They've completely messed this up, and he misses from about half a yard out, and it's like, wow, how has he missed that? Yeah,
it's he's literally in directly in front of the goal, and it's one of those head. If you're a Sunday League striker missed it on the weekend, you just like, how did he miss that? And
well, the cliche, maybe he had too much time to think about it. Yeah,
it comes out of the sky. But what was the when this whole Senegalese journey was going on after the France win and then kind of gaining momentum? What was the kind of impact of that, both in Senegal and also maybe across Africa? Because the rest of the African teams didn't have that great a tournament. I mean, Cameroon, like you said, and also South Africa.
Yeah, Nigeria disappointed as well. Yeah, just it was I mean, that is it, beating the world champions. I mean, like I said, there was parallels to Cameroon beating Argentina 12 years earlier. It was a big deal for, obviously, for Senegal. They had like national holidays, people out celebrating in the streets and everything like that, because they'd never experienced anything like that, not even close as a footballing nation. Ultimately it kicked. There's a huge legacy, if not just from that game, but from their entire tournament performance, to reach the second round and then to reach the quarterfinals. It was a big deal for the country. It was a big deal for Africa. It was the idea that there was not an established order in Africa, which is what people may have started to think by the end of the 90s, with obviously Cameroon, with Nigeria, perhaps with South Africa, even though they tailed off really badly after that. And the sort of the Arab teams, the North African teams, there was an idea that African football is only concentrated within these small parts, but then Senegal sort of really upset that by coming in and putting in such a great performance. And then you see in 2006 you had a load more teams come in, and obviously Ivory Coast and Ghana, the development that they had over the coming years was pretty much. Is it down to what Senegal did? is there an influence? Perhaps, there's certainly something there. There's certainly something that sort of helped kickstart things mentally for the countries across the entire continent. I felt, just because it was such a big win, such a big performance for them, and such a great display, and their own legacy. You had a number of players who ended up moving to Europe off the back of from their French clubs to the Premier League. You had a number of players, just obviously El Hadj Diouf, we all know everything he did. Aliou Cissé, Andy Faye, Salif Diao, Papa Bouba Diop, of course. All these players ended up coming to the Premier League and not disgracing themselves, but having decent careers at in the Premier League. I mean, even El Hadj Diouf, for the fact that he failed at Liverpool, he still played in the Premier League and, of course, for Rangers for years after that. I mean, he was still playing in Britain in 10 years after that World Cup. So he can't have been that bad of a player, can he? So
what is the story with El Hadj Diouf? Because I mean, some managers seem to be able to get kind of the best of him, but there was always these kind of like controversies kind of circling around him. Was he just sort of that kind of playing on the edge kind of a player, maybe like a Suarez or something like this, or what was the...
Well, that's the interesting thing, because obviously you watch that France game and he is just sort of like the direct, give him the ball and just let him do what he likes. And I think when he came to England, I think it was probably a bit of a culture shock that it was a change in the style of football, and maybe in those first months or years it was a struggle for him to sort of get acclimatized to the English game. But then he almost was able to recalibrate his own mentality and become this sort of nasty sort of kind of player, which has been adored in England for years. So for him to get criticism of it is very strange, to be honest. So he ended up sort of adapting to a different style of game that people didn't really expect, and especially for his size as well. He's a small, wiry kind of guy. To be getting stuck into those tackles, to be getting mouthy with other players, and being that sort of like nuisance of a footballer, ended up being the best thing for him, and that's what made him a relative success at the clubs he played for after his spell at Liverpool. So I felt that he was, by sheer fact that he was able to carve out a career in England was a huge thing for people back in Africa, and particularly Senegal. I mean, you look at someone like Sadio Mane now, who is not the kind of player that El Hadj Diouf turned out to be, but perhaps is the kind of player that Diouf was initially. And he just attributes he just says, El Hadj Diouf was like a hero to him and everyone growing up, in that era in Senegal, because what he went on to achieve. And so for how he's perceived, perhaps from an English point of view, is very different to how he's perceived in back in his homeland.
Yeah, of course. So after the group stage, they beat Sweden in the golden goal, but in the quarters they lost to Turkey in the golden. What was did the team just sort of run out of steam, or did they just come against a better team in Turkey? And is there kind of a lot of regret about that they weren't able to go to the semi-final?
So they lost to Turkey on a golden goal right at the start of the extra time period of a game where I think both teams, I mean, Turkey were as much as a surprise package in that World Cup as Senegal. Yeah. So I think both teams were perhaps nervous throughout that quarterfinal and just thinking, right, we can't mess this up because this is our chance to get to the World Cup.
They finally have something to lose kind of thing.
And so there was an apprehension on both sides. And I think, for Senegal, all the bold approach that they had taken beforehand, kind of, I don't want to say that they were fearful, but I did think there was definitely a point where they thought, actually, this, like you say, there is something to lose here. It's like, there's expectations have been raised, and and it was a golden goal that knocked them out. So it wasn't like they were soundly beaten or anything like that. It was just it could have gone either way. And again, because golden goal, in another tournament, maybe they come back and equalize in that extra time period, and maybe things are very different. So who knows? And I don't think there was a huge disappointment after that, because they exceeded expectations.
Yeah.
The disappointment comes after that, in that they took so long to qualify for another World Cup, because they missed the next three and didn't qualify again till 2018. So rather than use it as a platform for themselves, unfortunately, it didn't quite all come together after that. Whereas, like I say, for Cameroon and Nigeria, from their sort of first big tournament performances, they were able to sort of build on that. But
what about
Senegal,
within Africa? Did they have any success after that with that team, or like in Africa Cup of Nations
no,
or anything?
no, it didn't really. Yeah, it just didn't really come together. I think I just think a lot of the time, I mean, this is just me just speculating here. I think not that they got complacent after the players think that they've made it. It's just that now the priorities are different. Like,
Yeah.
if you're, you move to the Premier League and you think, right, this is where I've got focus of all my attention almost on this now, and that's not to say they disregard the importance of playing for Senegal, but having done the unthinkable by getting to a World Cup quarter final, it almost feels like, yeah, that it's probably not going to get better.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one of the things that always seems to, be in the press or come up when African teams at the World Cup is, stuff around bonuses, or that being kind of withheld. Do those problems still persist now, and do you think that still has an impact on their African teams' performances at World Cups?
So 2014 was pretty infamous for that, with Ghana and Cameroon and Nigeria. So I think beyond that, I mean, I've heard stories that they trying to like the FAs are trying to get negotiations with FIFA before tournaments to try and say, right, this is what and this is where the money will go, rather than it being taken away from the players before the tournament or whatever, mislaid or promised and not being delivered and things like that. So I think they're trying to find some sort of avenue to prevent this from happening in the future, because it has been a problem, especially you'd think it'd been more of a problem in the past, which it was, but for, like I say, for 2014, when you think a lot of these teams and players are now sort of more respected, more sort of known around the world, and better equipped to sort of cope with this sort of thing, it still hangs over them, and it shouldn't really. So and hopefully as time goes on, it stops being a major problem, and teams can actually focus on playing football and not letting distractions over money undermine what they're trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, since 2002, Ghana got to the quarterfinals in 2010, but from sort of then, maybe from 2002, where you're thinking, okay, African teams are kind of at the door and like about to take the next step and reach a semi-final. And obviously, Pele said that an African team will win the World Cup by 2000. Do you see this? And it seems that the gap is rather kind of expanding rather than contracting in many ways, with the World Cup increasingly becoming this kind of Western European tournament. Do you see that changing in the near future, or?
It's difficult to say. I think you're right in the sense that I think the sort of Western European teams are sort of pulling away, and
the kind of industrialization of huge,
even South American teams. I mean, you have even Brazil are not quite they're not the force that they have been in the past. Argentina, I mean, who knows what they do from year to year. I mean, they're two still very brilliant, great teams, but I think it is concentrating towards Europe a lot now, and I think that could be a problem for the rest of the world, not just Africa. But I think African teams, on the whole, I think organization is getting better. I think infrastructure is perhaps getting better. We go back to Senegal post 2002. I mean, like I said that they didn't qualify for another World Cup and they didn't win any AFCONs in that time, but Patrick Vieira, again, going back to him, he was part of setting up the charity and academy back in Senegal that helped produce players who would go on to feature for the national team, like Idrissa Gueye, who played in the 2018 World Cup for Senegal, was was a graduate of this academy, and obviously now he's playing for Paris Saint-Germain, and you have players like Sadio Mane, we've mentioned as well, Koulibaly at Napoli, who's up until this summer had been being talked about for like a 70-80 million pound defender. Arguably the best goalkeeper in the world right now. Benjamin Mendy's playing at Chelsea. I almost said Benjamin Mendy there. Oops, did not mean that at all. Yeah, Edouard Mendy. Yeah.
He'll be on to you as well.
Exactly. Yes, and rightfully so. Yeah, Edouard Mendy, who's arguably the best goalkeeper in the world right now, is playing for Senegal, and Ismail Assar at Watford, who he's been fantastic for them. Not just this season, the last couple of seasons, he's there. And I think, the quality of player coming out of not just Senegal, but a lot of the African teams is getting higher. I mean, again, not just Mane. You look at Mahrez at Man City, you got Salah at Egypt. These are among the best players in the world, aren't they? And they're all coming out of Africa. But it's just a case of just getting it to stick, I think. If there's, again, as much as I said, the organization's improved, it's still a little bit behind. And once if that all comes together, then maybe not a winner anytime soon, but more teams challenging in coming World Cups. I mean, Qatar should be very interesting to see. Well, we don't even know who's there yet, but of the teams that do get there, we'll be interested to see how they get on. Because now there's not. I mean, again, going back to what I was saying earlier about how it was perceived to be an established order of certain teams. Now there are probably about 10 teams now who are, if they show up at a World Cup, you're like, oh yeah, I remember them being in a World Cup previously. So it's not just the same teams that qualify all the time now.
There's an argument that you could say that Africa is like the hardest continent to qualify out of, because, like you say, there is a lot of depth of very quality teams, and there's only 5 places, but that will change for 2026.
Yeah. So this time around, I'm not even going to try to remember off the top of my head, but then you get a lot. So you'll get in the group stages. You'll have teams that you have got. I think it was Ghana and Ivory Coast were in the same group, possibly. Could be wrong there. But and only one team goes through to the playoffs, where they face another top side where they could go out. So it's is tough the way that the qualifying is for so few teams, and it's something that perhaps they want to rethink. But if we have World Cups every 2 years, then maybe things would be very different.
Just rotate the teams.
Yeah, exactly.
And then so finally, I mean, the Africa Cup of Nations is starting next month. Who should people be looking out for? What teams are going to be? Well,
I mean, I just reeled off all the names from the Senegalese squad there, and I think they're going to be among the favourites, along with Egypt, who obviously have Mo Salah there, who is, by far and away probably the best player in the world right now. And then you've also got Algeria.
And Senegal are still coached by the Aliou Cisse from
Aliou Cisse, who played in 2002. So you got Algeria again. So you got those two North African sides. You got Nigeria, who should be doing a lot better for the talent that's in the team. There's still sort of so much uncertainty over the managerial position and everything like that. But for the team that they've got, they should be doing a lot better. And Ghana will be among the favourites there as well. That's 5 teams so you can pick from there to potentially keep an eye on, and you could go on to win the tournament. Ivory Coast will always be up there, so they always worth looking at. So
On that, what did you make of this sort of war of words with Klopp and his comments on AFCON? Do you think it was a bit of a storm in a teacup, or it is actually,
I thought initially when I heard it, I thought it was a bit disrespectful on his part, but at the same time, I kind of think that's him. I just kind of think he hates everything now. Jurgen Klopp doesn't seem very happy at the moment.
No, he was happy last night, I think.
Well, yeah,
he was smiling.
Yeah, I mean, he just seems to, anything that just inconveniences him now, he just seems to he just seems to be angry at. I mean, well, like I say, when I first heard the comments, I thought, oh, that's hugely disrespectful. But then people pointed out that he says this about all the international football, basically. Yeah, exactly. So he's just very unhappy. He gets annoyed about domestic competitions, doesn't he? If there's an FA Cup game that gets in his way, he doesn't like that, does he? So he's
he still played Salah last night when it was, not necessarily.
There you go,
wildly off topic. But thank you so much, Ibrahim. Is there anything else that you're working on right now? Have you got another idea for a book that you're thinking about, or what's the plan?
I've got ideas, and they just need to come together. Basically, it's like, it's all, I have an idea, I write it down. It's like, right, okay, does that really work together? So we'll see. Maybe in the new year, may announce something or another. So yeah.
Okay,
But now,
cool.
nothing at the moment. Oh well, there's a couple of things in here. Up there in my brain.
You gotta move it from there onto the page.
I just got to move it. I mean, I've got it down on the page. I was just trying to connect it to make it interesting and to make sense, basically. So stuff will be coming, hopefully.
Okay, sounds great. And if people want to follow you on Twitter or anything like that, how would they get?
Just my name, Ibrahim Mustapha, all one word. It's Mustapha with a PH, not with an F as well. So that's all. That's me on Twitter. Do you want to follow me on Instagram? I've got a football themed Instagram account called My Random Football, all one word, and that's on Instagram. And those are the two main places if you want to keep up. So that's it.
All right, thanks so much, Ibrahim. It was absolute pleasure. Really interesting.
Alex, thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. Have a good evening.
You too. Take care.
Take care. Bye now.
Bye. Bye.